I have never seen anything the like. I have never heard of anything the like. I think these caves are unique and simply exceptional.
A cathedral and these caves, it's not the same thing. It's less complicated to build a cathedral than this.
It's made of granite, one of the hardest materials around. For me, it's not about great precision, it's about extreme precision. You can rebuild a cathedral with 300 well-motivated stonemasons, but BARABAR is currently on the verge of impossibility.
Welcome to the heart of ancient India, in a forgotten chapter of its past that could very well change history. Of all the countries we've had the chance to explore, India is probably the one that has impressed us the most. From its street children to the incessant honking of horns on its overcrowded roads, India is an unclassifiable land, and to visit it is a unique experience. With over 1,300,000,000 inhabitants, it's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. A world leader in technology, a bridge between ancient times and the present, between science and spirituality. India has a rich written history in the Vedas, held at the heart of the Hindu tradition, which constitute both a literary and spiritual treasure trove. These ancient writings, written in Sanskrit, India's oldest and most sacred language, are composed of rituals, hymns, prayers, and philosophical insights that have greatly influenced Indian culture. The most famous are probably the Bhagavad Gita and Mahabharata, in which some believe they portray a fantastic and highly technological ancient India. But these stories, like all the founding tales of our ancient civilizations, are considered just mythological and simply a reflection of the imagination of the ancient authors. How could it possibly be otherwise? Advanced science and technology existing in the distant past are, according to our historical narrative, impossible. Before our current historical record, we were just prehistoric humans, simple, primitive, as we would have been for almost 220,000 years, existing only by hunting and gathering. Looking back at our history, we have this sense of linear progress, starting with the wheel just a few thousand years ago and ending with smartphones. The first and only human industrial revolution took place in Europe just under 2 centuries ago. Otherwise, we would obviously have found traces of previous industries, and ancient India, like all other civilizations, have left nothing of the kind. Or so we believe. According to our history, the BARABAR and Nagarjuni chambers are simple shelters, offered 2,300 years ago by 2 kings to a group of beggars, protection from the rain during the monsoon season, meaning the case is essentially closed. Unlike other archaeological sites in the region, they are neither grandiose nor richly decorated, which is perhaps why they are unknown even to the Indians. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because when they're investigated in depth, they turn out to be so exceptional that they could be evidence of a very different technological past. Because we have no archives concerning the design, manufacture, or function of these chambers, until proven otherwise, such feats have never been reproduced in India or anywhere else in the world.
You can't just jump into a project like that out of the blue and say, hey, let's make a cave. It's not possible. It's not their first attempt.
Because the oldest inscriptions speak of donations, not manufacturing. Because they have been crafted with precision on par with the modern industrial world.
It's astonishingly precise.
Measuring in millimeter is normally only used for precisely engineering structures.
It's hard to imagine such volumes, but yes, it's ultra precise.
Because the true complexity of their shapes can only be revealed with 3D scans.
Yes, we don't follow a perfect shape, but we do follow a distribution of perfect symmetrical volumes, whether we're on the right, left, top or bottom.
Because they involve mathematical knowledge far beyond that which is currently attributed to ancient India.
You have to master the number pi with many, many decimals.
And because they interact with sound frequencies like no other place in the world. And this is perhaps the real key to their mystery. We visited them for the first time in January 2017. Listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the chambers are spread across the archaeological sites of BARABAR and Nagarjuna, some 40 kilometers from Bodh Gaya, a city famous in Buddhism as the place where Buddha is said to have experienced his enlightenment. After about an hour-and-a-half drive, we reach the BARABAR site via a long staircase that leads us to what geologists call a whale's back. A huge granite core some 100 meters long. Inside, 3 chambers have been carved out. For the sake of convenience, we've kept the chamber names used in our previous film, but they're probably not original. The first, when arriving on site, is Karan Choppa. The entrance is a trapezoidal passage wider at the bottom than at the top, which penetrates directly into the bedrock. Engraved inscriptions can be seen in this passageway, which opens onto a rectangular chamber at its base, with very slightly sloping walls. Along the width, a bench has been cut into the rock. Despite a few imperfections, it is so polished that it looks almost metallic to the camera. The vaulted ceiling appears cylindrical. Let's move on to the other side of this whale's back. This is the entrance to the Sudamar chamber, which differs from the previous one in that it first has a recess, which stonecutters call a first bear, into which the passage is cut. Also engraved with inscriptions, it leads to a rectangular chamber with a cylindrical vaulted ceiling and smooth, shiny walls, also slightly inclined. In this wall is a niche, unfinished and not of the period. The wall facing it has a curved shape and is topped by a portion of the dome that makes it look like a mushroom. In the center of this wall, a passageway leads to a dome with a half-spherical ceiling. Some 30 meters from Sudama, still carved from the same whale's back, is the Lomas Rishi chamber. It's the only one with a porch, beautifully decorated and very circular, often the first photo you see when searching the site. Unlike the previous two, the entrance frame is curved. It is followed by a trapezoidal passageway, which has no inscriptions. This unfinished chamber seems to be a copy of Sudama, unless it's a failed attempt. 3 of the walls appear almost finished, while the rest of the chamber is still in the rough. The passageway to the dome is almost complete, but the dome is a long way off. Everywhere there are random pick traces, a tool used to rough out the shape by removing large portions of material. From this whaleback, a path leads to Visvazopri, the last isolated chamber, which is also unfinished. It differs completely from the others in its entrance. It's a sort of vestibule, almost finished because the walls are polished but not the floor. An inscription is engraved on the right-hand wall. A trapezoidal passage leads to a chamber not far enough advanced to guess the final shape, probably circular. .6 kilometers away as the crow flies, from the BARABAR site is the Nagarjuni site, a natural pile of hundreds of rocks formed over millions of years, known as a granitic chaos. On this side, at the end of the steep staircase, the Gopika chamber has been carved out of solid rock. An unframed trapezoidal passage, resembling that of Karan Chopper, leads to a large oval-shaped chamber. Its sloping walls are once again smooth as glass, and its vaulted ceiling harmonious. A long fissure runs through the entire length. On the other side of this granitic chaos, at the end of a long path, we reach the Vapiyaka chamber. It has a similar entrance to that of Sudama, consisting of a rectangular frame followed by a trapezoidal passageway in which inscriptions are engraved on both sides. Facing south, it's the brightest of all. Its equally sloping walls are topped by a cylindrical vaulted ceiling. In the rock next to it, the Vedataka entrance passage lies a little hemmed in. With its trapezoidal cross-section, similar to those of Karan Chopper and Gopika, it leads to an entirely curved hall, harmoniously shaped like a slipper, whose walls are once again completely smooth. This gives us a total of 7 chambers, 5 completed and 2 unfinished, which would have been donated around 2,300 years ago in 300 BC. We were amazed by their upright walls, as smooth and flat as slabs of marble, so smooth and polished that they are almost mirrored, even though they were carved out of granite, one of the hardest rocks in the world. You're probably no more familiar with this stonemason jargon than we were when we started our research. So let's start by explaining what a dressed surface is. It's a rough surface that has been struck to make it more or less flat. There is a big difference between a smooth surface and a flat one. Smooth means soft to the touch, sanded and polished, while flat means totally flat. It can be smooth, but not necessarily flat, and it can be flat and not necessarily smooth. But at BARABAR and Nagarjuni, it is both smooth and flat, which is apparently a unique configuration in cave art. Talking about it is one thing, but measuring surfaces is quite another. And for that we use, among other tools, a roughness tester. But if you don't know us, you're probably wondering what this device is. And what are we doing with it? And who are we? We're a team with a passion for studying ancient archaeological sites, to which we've already devoted several films, with a different perspective, more technical than historical. For when the written word is silent, buildings speak. Their design and construction testify to the scientific and technical level of their designers and speak volumes about the relationship they had with the world. The astonishing complexity of the BARABAR and Nagarjuna chambers is a real enigma, and one you'll soon understand. Confronted with an enigma with no apparent solution, the French philosopher and mathematician René Descartes advised us to forget everything we think we know about the subject. Just make a clean slate and start afresh. Faced with this kind of surface, we can't help but think beyond the scantily clad worker equipped with the basic chisel hammer and capable of feats that defy our modern reason. What if parts of our history have been forgotten? Like the Antikythera mechanism, presented in our previous film, which disappeared 2,000 years ago, before a copy was found at the bottom of the sea. A mechanism that calls into question everything we thought we knew about the scientific and technical level of the ancient Greeks. What's worse is that, not content with having forgotten it, history didn't take the ancient authors who wrote about it seriously. But let's get back to the roughness tester. This device measures the roughness of a surface, i.e. the difference between its reliefs, to the micron or micrometer, i.e. to the thousandth of a millimeter. To explain how it works, we called on Michael Toutain, an engineer from the manufacturer of our device.
The SJ210 consists of a body and a stylus with runners for roughening flat surfaces.
We measure what we call roughness.
It's a measurement of a product surface finish.
RZ is a type of measurement. The smaller the value, the smoother and more flawless the surface. Granite is composed of quartz, feldspar, and mica. Quartz being the hardest and most difficult to flatten and polish. Measuring surface accuracy on the hardest mineral helps determine overall accuracy, and therefore the quality of the whole job. In 2017, on our first visit, geologist Eric Gontier ran the roughness tester at BARABAR and Nagarjuna, and here's what we got. To appreciate these results, we need a point of comparison. We asked Michael to run the roughness tester over what we call a marble, even though it's an industrially polished slab of granite.
We're going to take a measurement of an industrially produced marble which has been rectified, so it's granite. We'll simply launch our measurement. At the same time, the RZ value of 9.492 can be seen. These marbles are made by machines, in fact. On vertical surfaces in handmade caves, we find values, shall we say, of RZ 9 times less imposing. It's pretty incredible, though.
To continue the comparisons, this marble slab was polished with this machine. And when you run the roughness tester over it, here's what you get. And on the glass of a window, we retook around 80 measurements in BARABAR in April 2023. Here's the best one obtained in Sudama, a chamber that's 2,300 years old, at least. That's barely more than window glass, and almost 20 times more precise than this industrially polished slab of granite.
C'est absolument incroyable. On croyait que ça a été fait avec au laser. Enfin, ça n'a pas été fait au laser. Ça s'est fait à la main.
Faced with such walls, you can't help but think powerful machines were used in their creation. That would simplify the matter considerably. But at this stage of the investigation, small imperfections seem to point towards the use of tools guided by the human hand, to an astonishing level of precision. The result of 9.492 does not mean that we would be unable to polish granite as precisely as we do in BARABAR, but simply that it is more than sufficient to check the conformity of certain industrial parts. As Michael Toutain points out, the walls of these chambers are almost vertical, because it's one thing to be able to polish surfaces horizontally in the direction of gravity, but it's another thing to polish vertically, or even more complicated, inside the curved ceilings. But to better appreciate the exceptional nature of the work carried out at BARABAR, let's visit the Son Bandar site. On this site, there are two chambers which have been dated on the basis of its inscriptions to around the 3rd or 4th century AD, i.e. more than 600 years after BARABAR. The entrance passage to the first is a trapezoidal cross-section. It resembles that of Karanchapa, Gopika and Vadatika. Today, the chamber is topped by a concrete structure, probably to reinforce it. As on the right, the ceiling of the second chamber has been completely shattered, leaving it open to the sky. The first chamber has a window, but given the state of the second, we don't know if it also had one. Sculptures can be seen, as well as inscriptions on which the dating of the site is based. But as humans have the annoying habit of replacing their predecessors' names, this dating is disputed by an Indiologist, i.e. an archaeologist dedicated to India. They were carved from metamorphic schist, a rock that is less hard than granite, but also less homogeneous, which explains why some parts are more polished than others. But the vague resemblance with BARABAR and Nagarjuna ends there. The walls are neither totally flat nor totally polished. They're not sloped, the floor is not level and far from it. In short, the work isn't much to look at. And yet this project would have been completed over 600 years after those of BARABAR and Nagarjuna. The sense of progress, as we know, has been slapped in the face. But how do you explain this? Quite simply, because techniques can quickly be lost to invasion, war, epidemics, or changes in power, which is why no chambers or carved chambers will ever match those of BARABAR or Nagarjuna. No chambers? No. There's just one more, which took us a while to locate. Because in India, distances are not measured in kilometers, but in travel time. The Sitamarhi chamber is located around 70 kilometers from BARABAR, carved out of a totally isolated rock against which a modern building has been erected. Very small, around 5 meters by 3.5 meters, its shape could be a cross between Vapiyaka and Vadatika. As it's used religiously today, it was difficult for us to investigate further. The surfaces are very degraded and do not appear mirror polished as in BARABAR, as they are covered in soot, which by the way was not found in BARABAR or Nagarjuna. It has no inscriptions, and no one knows whether it was part of the BARABAR and Nagarjuna chambers or whether it was made before or after. It's hard to find detailed information about it, and especially correct information, because here's how archaeologist Percy Brown portrayed it in his book. The article was then taken up by other books and blogs and finally integrated onto a Wikipedia page, where we even speculate on the influence of the incorrect pointed arch on subsequent constructions. On-site studies are essential. They sometimes lead to important realizations, such as that of Indologist Harry Falk, an indisputed specialist in the life of King Ashoka, and in our opinion, the author of the most important works on the BARABAR and Nagarjuna chambers. Here's what he wrote about them in his book, one of the most comprehensive to date.
Of technical perfection.
Only a combination of devotion, a belief in achieving the impossible, fanaticism, indifference to expense, a sense of aesthetic, a love of technical perfection, and a desire for recognition by future generations would lead someone to initiate such work. This combination has no equal in ancient India.
First of all, let's go over a brief history of the discovery of the chambers. In 1785, John Herbert Harrington discovers 4 of the chambers, abandoned for centuries: Karanchapa, Sudama, Lomas Rishi, and Gopika. No one knows who made them, when or why. 1811, Francis Buchanan found a new chamber in BARABAR, Visvasopri, and 2 more in Nagarjuna, Vapyaka, and Vadatika. 1837. At Nagarjuna, James Prinsep deciphers inscriptions in Brahmi, a language used over 2,000 years ago, which tells us that Vapyaka, Vadatika, and Gopika were offered by King Dasharatha to the Ajivika sect for protection from the rain. 1847. Markham Kitto discovered an almost faded and illegible inscription in Brahmi on the facade of Karan Chapar. 1861. Alexander Cunningham attributes the BARABAR chambers to King Ashoka, supposedly Dasharatha's father or grandfather. 1925. Eugene Hölsch deciphers the inscription discovered by Kitto and concludes that the BARABAR chambers are also rain shelters. The case of these enigmatic chambers has finally been solved. But in 1997, Harry Falk challenged Hölsch's translation. While BARABAR chambers were indeed donated by King Ashoka, no function is mentioned. That's where the research stood in 2017, when we discovered them. Third king of the Maurya dynasty, founded by his grandfather, King Chandragupta Maurya, Ashoka is thought to have commissioned these chambers. In the 8th year of his reign, intent on taking the pacifist feudal state of Kalinga, Ashoka led India into the deadliest war of its history, claiming over 100,000 lives and taking over 150,000 prisoners.
Ashoka followed Iranian mercenaries to have that Kalinga war effected, to his desperation in the end.
Deeply regretful, Ashoka converted to Buddhism and spent a year in a retreat at a monastery.
The small movement of the Buddhists, it was not a big thing as we know nowadays. It was a small group. And without Ashoka, Buddhism would have disappeared.
He is said to have reigned about 28 years, gifting BARABAR's chambers to the Ajivika, a group of beggars who live virtually naked.
Ashoka changed India from a clay and bamboo country to a stone country. Same thing like Augustus changed Rome from a wooden town to a stone town. There's nothing that you can point out and say the stone technology was there. And at such a height of technology, it's not just stonework, it is perfection.
Together with the Ashoka pillars, each weighing around 30 tons, these chambers are believed to represent the first Maurya stoneworks, whose main characteristic is the Maurya polish. Let's look now at the dating of the chambers, based on the engraved inscriptions. If those attributed to Ashoka are anything to go by, the earliest would be those of BARABAR. Among them, Sudama is said to have been the first gifted by Ashoka. We find a dedication that has been translated as follows. This cave called Nagroda was given to the Ajivika by King Priyadasan when he was anointed for his 12th year of reign. Priyadasan refers to Ashoka. The word Ajivika has been scratched out and no function is indicated. It was also in the 12th year of Ashoka's reign that the Visvazopri chamber was gifted. Here again, the term Ajivika has been scratched out, no function is indicated, and it's dedicated even though it's not finished. Then, 7 years later, Karan Chapar was gifted to the Ajivika. According to Eugene Hölsch, the inscription has long been interpreted as follows. When I, King Priyadasan, had been anointed 19 years, this cave in the very pleasant Kalatika mountain was given for shelter during the rainy season. But after cleaning it, Harry Falk proposed a new reading. King Priyadasan came to Jaluta when he was anointed for his 19th year of reign. On that occasion, he gave this cave called Supriyeksa to the Ajivika.
There's no proposal from my side. There's only a reading, and everybody who goes there has no choice but to read the same thing.
No mention of a shelter then. As for Lomas Rishi, there is no dedication dating from the Ashoka period, because it is unfinished. But this argument doesn't hold up in the Visvazopri, which is also unfinished and yet dedicated. As for the Nagarjuna chambers, they were gifted by Ashoka's successor, Dasharatha, Ashoka's son or grandson, as soon as he ascended the throne. An early inscription reads, "This cave called Vapyaka was handed over to the respectable Ajivika as a residence for the rainy season as long as the moon and sun will last, by Dasharatha, beloved of the gods, as soon as he was installed as king." Same text for Vadatika and Gopika, only the names of the chambers have changed.
There's only a short time between Ashoka and Dasharatha, and he could have been his son, or he could have been his grandson.
If Dasharatha gifted the chambers as soon as he started his reign, it was because they had already been made.
The idea that all the caves have been ordered to be made by Ashoka is quite widespread.
This means that all the BARABAR and Nagarjuna chambers would have had to have been produced in 28 years, the entire duration of Ashoka's reign. Importantly, none of these inscriptions, either at BARABAR or Nagarjuna, mention manufacturing, only donations. Later inscriptions show that some people did not hesitate to have their names engraved, without actually being the creators of these chambers. In BARABAR, on the porch of Lomas Rishi in the 5th century CE, around 700 years after Ashoka, and on the walls of the entrance passages to other chambers. Finally, there's a mention of Ashoka's gifting of the BARABAR chambers in the 27th year of reign, but French Indologist Jules Bloch remains cautious if the donations of the caves to the Ajivika are indeed his. The uninscribed upper part of one of these spectacular broken pillars has been transported to Bodh Gaya.
There have been no pillars in India, and suddenly you have huge, heavy 30-ton pillars all over India, carried to places with inscriptions, erected, having a capital and having a beautiful animal on top. Out of the blue, out of nothing. There's not a single pillar that is older or anything the like.
The sudden existence of the pillars, like the chambers, is intriguing, as they seem to all spring up out of nowhere. An important point, nowhere can we find any kind of prototype, i.e. the places where workers practiced and trained to acquire the knowledge and exceptional mastery needed to create the chambers. If they are indeed the first of their kind in India, where do the skills come from? Faced with this crucial problem of the absence of prototypes, and perhaps in search of a totally Indian origin for knowledge and techniques, the Indologist Gupta rejected the Sombandar inscriptions, moving back its dating by a century before BARABAR to 400 BC, therefore making it the missing link between the natural caves and the BARABAR chambers. Doing this shows that the validity of an inscription can be called into question, an interesting fact to read from an Indologist.
The other ways around is more likely that Ashoka was there as the first, and Sombandar is simply a copy of it.
There are two answers to BARABAR's technical miracle. The first, it being supernatural, comes from Sitamari, where a pujari, a priest, still officiates today. Harry Falk met his predecessor on his first visit in '93.
He said, "The gods have made this. Do you think that men could do it?" This was his words.
The second, it being historical, is that the skills needed to make them come from the Persians and their Achaemenid tombs, which would explain why BARABAR and Nagarjuna are unique in India.
And if any culture would have been able to do that, people if living in that area, they would have done it more than once.
Entry is strictly forbidden, but the few photos available show that it's not at all the same quality of workmanship. Neither for the vaulted ceilings nor for the walls, which don't have flat polished surfaces, which are not inclined. Is it even possible to achieve such results on the first try, without ever having done it before? When it comes to stonemasonry, as companion member Eric Bernard points out,
well, the archaeologist may well speak for the stonemason, but the stonemason has the last word in all this, because he knows his limits.
Now the most important thing, the function of these chambers.
When we think about the purpose of the caves, we see that there is a sort of a difference between Nagarjuna Hills and BARABAR. In Nagarjuna Hills, Dasharatha says he hands over the caves for the Ajivikas so that they have a place to stay when the rains start pouring down in the monsoon. There is no good reason to produce such caves only as rain shelters. For my taste, these caves are royal caves. This brilliance is royal. It has nothing to do with the life of an ordinary ascetic, be he Buddhist or Ajivika or Jain or whatever. Whoever sees these caves will think of the royal family and of the personality of Ashoka, who was able to have such caves produced.
If they were indeed made during Ashoka's reign, i.e. in about 28 years, would they have been immediately passed on to the Ajivika?
He did not make them for the Ajivikas. In the end, he wanted to get rid of these caves. I think it is quite possible that the two 12-year inscriptions, so-called 12-year inscriptions, have been inscribed much later than the 12th year, and that even the names were invented by the Ajivikas.
So let's recap. These chambers, along with the pillars, are believed to be the first Maurya works in polished stone. They would have been carried out over a period of around 28 years. They were the first of their kind, and the knowledge could have been imported. Shelter would not necessarily be their primary function. All the inscriptions could have been engraved long after the chambers were built and do not constitute irrefutable proof of dating or its original function. And finally, looking collectively at all the previous work, we have no definitive answers.
It saves a lot of time thinking if you stick to your own idea, and particularly if you have written about something. That's the end of most strong ideas. They stay there, because otherwise you would have to confess in writing that in earlier writings you have been wrong.
Harry Falk's presence in this film does not imply that he agrees with our hypothesis. We sincerely wish to thank him for playing the difficult role of spokesperson for an archaeological community unable to speak on this topic with one voice, which he sums up with humour.
If you have two archaeologists, you find three opinions. So every possible opinion has been published in writing and in lectures. So without making one better than the other.
All these past researchers were missing critical information simply because they didn't have access to the technology we do now, and that's exactly where our team comes in. During our January 2017 exploration, we had tried to measure these chambers with a rangefinder, a laser that measures distance, but it didn't work because of the sloping walls. The laser beam hit lower down in front and made precise measurements impossible. That's why we asked Art Graphique Patrimon, or AGP, a company founded by former stonemason, from a long line of stonemasons, to 3D scan the BARABAR and Nagarjuna chambers. Each one was scanned as it stood, with at least 2,300 years of wear and tear, dust, wasp nests, and limestone deposits on some walls due to water infiltration, as well as all the damage done over time. It took us 2 days on site, with 3 to 6 scans per chamber, each defined by millions of points, i.e. 1 point every millimetre, with a precision of around 2.5 millimetres plus or minus. This inaccuracy means that the volumes of space vary proportionally, with much less impact on angles. AGP then assembled all the point clouds for each chamber. These point clouds represent the chambers in 3 dimensions without any optical distortion.
You'd think it was actually a geometric 3D model. You see a three-dimensional image, like an MRI, what exists, Once we have it in 3 dimensions, we slice it up, like an MRI, to understand and interpret.
So these are not computer-generated representations, but exact reconstructions, which can be seen most clearly in the scans of the unfinished Lomas Rishi and Visvasopri chambers.
It's unfinished or modified, we don't know. You can see straight away that the capture is real, and on all the others, it's the same thing. Just because it looks like something perfectly geometrical doesn't mean it's a fake, no. It's reality as measured by the metrological device.
When the previous film was completed, AGP provided us with some floor plans, telling us that these chambers were all symmetrical in length. Symmetrical? If you didn't jump at the mention of the word, it's because you don't yet know exactly what it implies. Symmetrical means that you can cut the chambers in half lengthways and superimpose each part exactly on the other, the left half on the right, and vice versa. If you did this with your apartment, it's likely that the space would not be symmetrical, as precision tolerances in modern construction vary by a few centimeters. But to quantify these symmetries, we needed the detailed scan analysis report. It's a 40-page dossier of figures and findings, some of which we're going to share with you. AGP warns of noise due to highly reflective surfaces that make measurements slightly blurred.
There's a mirror effect on it, and this mirror effect will reflect the laser, giving it that measurement noise.
Striations also appear in various places, but they don't exist in reality.
Precisely. It's the measurement noise that we're seeing here. You get the impression that the markings here are very deep, whereas we're talking about 0.5 of a millimeter.
We'll break down the volume of space in this way: large walls, small walls, ceiling birth line, and of course the vaulted ceiling. On this cross-section of the ground scan, the outer line has a certain thickness.
Because the wall isn't perfectly vertical, the difference in plumb that we have here, it's the thickness that we find here, and we can see it directly with the 3rd dimension.
To familiarize you with their language, AGP informs us of a ground trace with virtually no deformation, which means
you could say that we're perfect to within 0.10 degrees, which is relative perfection.
And when it comes to symmetry, as in the case with Gopika, where 62% of the 350 million points are in the same place, within a 2.5mm tolerance.
On complex shapes like that, yes, we're perfectly symmetrical. There's just no discussion here. It's symmetrical.
Here is the gist of the report. Chamber 1, Vapiaka. This scan is defined by 132 million points. Entrance passage precisely centered on short side. Rectangle on the ground with virtually no deformation, perfect right angles to within 1/10 of a degree. Small walls inclined at 88.5 degrees vary by 0.8 of a degree along the entire length. Large walls at 87 degrees vary at 1/10 of a degree. Vaulted ceiling formed by a perfectly centered circular arc. Perfectly horizontal ground and ceiling start line. Longitudinal symmetry. Vaulted ceiling cut lengthwise, right part superimposed on left and vice versa. 69.7% of points in the same place within a 2.5mm tolerance. Transverse symmetry widthwise, 75.1% of points within a 2.5mm tolerance. Chamber 2, Karan Choppa. Cloud composed of 132 million points. Entrance passage placed at the intersection of a square built on the short side. Near perfect floor rectangle. Small 89-degree inclined walls. Large walls inclined at 87.3 degrees. Vaulted ceiling formed by a combination of 3 centered arcs. Perfectly level floor. Longitudinal symmetry, 77.6% of points in the same place. Transverse symmetry, 67.8% of points in the same place. Chamber 3, Vadatika. Cloud composed of 110 million points. Entrance passage centered on short side, 5 degrees offset from the perpendicular. No start line and vaulted ceiling, fully curved section. Chamber formed by square plus semicircle. Side wall floor angle 85.5 degrees. Angle of inclination of curved bottom wall 83.7 degrees. Angle of inclination on short side, 88.5 degrees. Vaulted ceiling composed of 3 centered arcs. Perfectly level floor. Symmetry, 57.7% of points in the same place. Chamber 4, Gopica, 350 million points cloud. The entrance passage is placed at the intersection of a circle built on the short side. Angle of inclination of large walls, 87 degrees. Ground and start line of ceiling precisely horizontal. The shape of the chamber is slightly oval. The large walls are slightly curved by less than 6 centimeters along their entire length. On the floor, there are portions of circles with a radius of 120 meters. Vaulted ceiling composed of 3 interlocking rib sections. Apart from the floor and the sides of the entrance passages, this chamber is entirely composed of curves. Longitudinal symmetry, 62% of points in the same place. Chamber 5, Sudama, 232 million points cloud. This chamber has 2 rooms. First perpendicular entry passage set at 1/5 the length of the long side. Second entrance passage, perpendicular and centered. The curved wall of the chamber 1 follows precisely the inner wall of chamber 2. Large side walls inclined at 87.1 degrees. Small 89-degree inclined side panel. The wall of chamber 2 is inclined at 86.7 degrees. The vaulted ceiling of chamber 1 consists of a cylinder of constant radius, centered on the longitudinal axis. Horizontal floors. Symmetry, 61.1% of points in the same place. Thanks to this report, we now know the constraints given to the stonemasons before they start work. Shapes, precise dimensions, and angles, the so-called specifications. And in this case, it's truly mind-boggling. Firstly, these 5 chambers are symmetrical. The slightest variation in shape on one side will be mirrored on the other. Secondly, the position of the entrance passages follows a particular geometric logic. Finally, the shapes are more complex than they appear. The large walls of Vapiaka and Karanchopa are inclined at different angles and mirror each other. Vapiaka and Sudama's vaulted ceilings are portions of cylinders. Vadatika's shape is composed of several intermingled spheres. Gopika's large walls are very slightly curved and inclined. Karanchopa's vaulted ceiling is made up of 3 cylinder sections. Gopika's vaulted ceiling is composed of 3 ribbed sections. A surveyor and topographer produced a second report based on the raw scan data, extending AGP's work and revealing new features.
We start with this breakdown of cloud portions and break them down. I take only the points measured by the scanner, and then I ask the software to calculate the best sphere to approximate all these points. We do the same thing with our point cloud, which is on the other side, but cut off. For us, it is as if we were 2 completely independent clouds in space. So we start a new calculation. And that's what's going to be interesting, is that when we take these point clouds that are positioned in different places, we're going to get similar information on both sides, right and left.
In other words, these 2 ends of the ceiling are portions of spheres which are symmetrical with their centers aligned.
3,956, 3,953. These may be numerically different values, but in terms of results and measurements, and in terms of measurement certainty or uncertainty, we can correlate these 2 figures very well. Given the imprecision of the scan noise, 3.953 equals 3.956.
These aren't only portions of spheres you can see, it's much more complex than that.
In other words, here the size deviations from the original geometric shape are symmetrical. They made the same mistake on each side, and they made the same mistake following the same model. So it's not a mistake.
The vaulted ceiling is made up of fused portions of curved lines and spheres, all mirrored. He then proceeded in the same way with Vadatika. The software produced a perfect sphere, shown in blue in this image.
What we can look at is the distribution of points in relation to a sphere, and here we have a truly remarkable diffusion of colors found symmetrically and homogeneously on each side. In other words, we're not following a perfect shape, but we are following a perfect symmetrical volume distribution, whether we're on the right, left, top or bottom.
The designers of this chamber didn't want to create the perfect section of a sphere, but this specific shape, since it's symmetrical. Finally, here is an extract from the third report produced by a companion stonemason, a specialist in three-dimensional geometry, a simple observation made in Gopika. As a reminder, today's standard for paving flatness is level tolerance. A 2-meter ruler must not show a difference in alignment greater than 2 millimeters, i.e. 1 in 1,000 on a plane. Here we have 1 in 100,000 in a three-dimensional space. What can I say?
I don't believe for a second that it's done to look pretty and please oneself. When you put so much energy into developing something like this, there must be a reason. I don't know what the reason is. To achieve a level of symmetry and finish in stone cutting like this, you need to be at the very top of your craft. And so, we are at the pinnacle of what can be done at that moment.
Plans, statements, figures, but what do they actually mean? How complicated is it to create these chambers? Who better to enlighten us than the stonemasons, who for centuries have been master builders and secret keepers? Our investigation took us to Brittany, the land of granite, to Nantes, then to Paris, where we met stonemasons who agreed to look into the case of these chambers. Eric Bernard, companion member, an architect with over 40 years' experience. Olivier Levine, companion for 30 years, who has studied ancient carving in Egypt for 25 years. Frank Petita, former stonemason. Mathieu Anoff, stonemason turned fitter who currently manages masonry and stonemasonry projects for heritage restoration companies. Louis-Joseph Lamboro, son, grandson and great-grandson of stonemasons, who has worked for over 30 years restoring historic monuments in Paris and now runs his own stonehouse manufacturing business. Joël Caravet, artisan granite stonemason for over 40 years, and Christophe Kini, artisan granite stonemason for 28 years. We showed them the chambers and the AGP report and asked them to rate the work on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the easiest and 10 being the most difficult.
We're at 9.5 for difficulty of work.
10.
10? Maybe even 12?
10, even 20?
Well, it's simple, I'll put 12.
Well, for the sake of argument, I'd say 12. At least to put the object in the context of our reality.
You've got to have hit a rock in granite to know what it's like, the complexity of it, and done some geometry. That's why people who haven't done this thing can't understand it.
Before AGP, we could think, yeah, we're professional men, not afraid of anything. But the specific demand is outstanding. You have to understand that. So we're capable of making a chamber like that, with more or less the same finished polish. It's pleasing to the eye, but we wouldn't match the required specifications. That is very clear. In other words, curves of 120 meters in diameter and 13 meters long, we'll do them, but then if you put AGP scans on our work, we run the risk of looking like...
There are many stages before arriving at the softened and polished form, and each stage brings its own share of errors and inaccuracies. So, if in the end you achieve this precision, it's because all the stages have been mastered.
It's not just mastery of the materials, but also mastery of geometry. Because that means we start by making a door, and we already know exactly what we're going to do next.
If we'd used frescoes or something like that, it would have stood up the work and concealed any imperfections. With geometric perfection, there's no forgiveness, no room for error.
Digging inside a rock and rendering a polished finish like that, I have no idea how they did it. Either they spent centuries polishing, I don't know, with lots of little arms that never stopped. Honestly, I have no explanation. It's made of granite, one of the hardest materials around. But today, I'm pretty sure we couldn't do it.
Perhaps we could actually meet this requirement by fitting blocks and so on. But to excavate it like that? No. I don't see any possibilities at the moment. I don't see any possibilities right now.
And even with mechanical tools to achieve such a result, it's still complicated.
Nowadays, we wouldn't be more precise with much more developed means. Because in fact, we're dealing with a rustic size. So we couldn't put in all the facilities that would allow us to have something even more precise. So we couldn't do any better.
To make a BARABAR type chamber with hand tools, first rough out the general shape with picks, and then work with a variety of progressively finer chisels, and then rub the surface with a paste made from abrasive chemicals.
Can we start over as many times as it takes?
And finally polishing. At the polishing stage, the shape is already completely finished.
It's absolutely essential that the facing is perfect and straight before you even start rubbing to achieve that mirror polish.
The polish will be uniform, so it will remove the same thickness everywhere. So any defects will be visible. There's a geometric shape that's defined. So going beyond those limits is out of the question. So we have to get close to it. So there's all the polishing that's going to take a bit of material too. Therefore, if you want to get right down to it, that means you've understood and you know how thick you're going to polish. What's interesting about polishing, in the case of these caves, is that it also shows the level of execution, because polishing vault ceilings is a hell of a job. Here again, there's a demonstration of extraordinary mastery.
It's manageable on workshop surfaces, on a table and so on. But here, on a regulated surface, clean with no tool marks, ready to be polished, it's mind-blowing. It's completely unique.
Is it really possible to embark on such a project without ever having done it before?
It's not the work of a beginner, nor a qualified or highly qualified person. It's a qualified, hyper-qualified person we don't know today.
It's deliberate.
It's deliberate, it's planned, and there's no room for error. You can't make changes along the way.
There's an extraordinary mastery of geometry and equally extraordinary mastery of materials. This means that there are years and years of apprenticeship before that. That's why you can't just jump into a job like that from one day to the next and say, hey, let's make a cave. It's not possible. You wouldn't have the same quality and finish if it were a trial run. There would be a few little mistakes, a few little adjustments, and see the evolution through the caves. But here, it's clear that they are the same level of finish, which corresponds to the level of qualification of the workers. So it does not come from nowhere.
When you see the results, you get the impression that it's all done by one hand because it's so regular, so perfect, that you don't get the impression that there were so many people working on it.
This place vibrates like something that's the result of a joint effort, a group cohesion that is mind-blowing.
Every step of the process has the potential to go wrong and ruin the project. I've witnessed multiple conflicts, and for reasons far less complicated than that. So, in my opinion, they've reached a level of cohesion that's really astonishing. The human commitment here is quite enormous.
The report revealed the symmetries of the chambers that no one had seen before these scans. Can you make symmetrical shapes by accident?
It can't be chance, clearly it's really calculated, done on purpose.
Nothing is done at random. Everything has a reason that's obvious to me.
Chance is out of the question.
We have to start from very precise reference points that will be defined from the outset before we can cut, meaning we don't just show up and say, oh, we're going to do it here. No. Before we do it, we know very well that there are a minimum number of symmetrical reference points that we need to take, and from that, we can define everything else. So they decide beforehand.
It means that this symmetry is imposed and imposes pure rigor on the execution.
The symmetry is pushed pretty far in the construction. It's no coincidence that this was intended at a given moment. It was executed in this way. That's what we can see today from our measurements.
If you add symmetry to the volume, it doubles the complexity. Yet another constraint.
If we don't have the symmetry constraint, we move ahead. And then it's visually acceptable, we stop the work. On the other hand, if the specifications are so demanding that millimeters have to be present everywhere, then it's a different kettle of fish. It's twice the work, 10 times the work.
Making a reversible copy-paste of the two forms at this level of precision, it's the worst thing, shown by the results of the scans, which has everything to mess with a professional.
What about the precision of the scans and measurements?
Getting to be more precise than that is going to be very, very complicated. I mean, you can tell that they've gone all the way.
Given the resources available at the time, I find this precision mind-boggling.
For me, it's not great precision, it's extreme precision. It's astonishingly precise. In a material like this, with a polished finish, the gaps that can be measured with today's extremely sophisticated tools. Honestly, that's the most impressive, the most amazing thing. We ourselves, for much simpler things, are not so precise. It's that in the field of mechanical production, with volumes 1,000 times smaller, so much easier to master. So I don't know, that's the most impressive part. Precision, for me, as a stonemason.
Measuring in millimeter is normally only used for precisely engineering structures, for monitoring nuclear stations, for things or structures that require analysis of movements that are themselves millimeters.
When you look at the potential discrepancies in the 3D scan, when we're talking about symmetry with discrepancies of 3, 4, 5 millimeters maximum, it's something that's hard to imagine on such volumes. Yes, it's ultra precise.
What level of stress is involved in such excavation work?
There is darkness, there's dustiness.
If there are 20 craftsmen working in the same cave, after 2 hours, everyone will die of heat in there. So at some point, you're going to have to get out to cool off. There'll also be the problem of light.
Working 10 or 12 hours a day in such small volumes, I honestly don't see how we could do that.
The problem is that someone who has undergone 10 years of training to reach the top of his profession, it would be a shame to waste him after 5 years with silicosis because he's been working in a cave.
We haven't changed in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. We're still the same. There are specifications, deadlines, and it's just like today. You've got a job to do, a project owner, project manager, and then you have to get on with it.
The question on everyone's lips: how long would it take to make one?
You can imagine anything, but that would be pure speculation. Now, if you imagine manual labor, I can only imagine it, working over a very long period of time, but with infinite patience to achieve this result with this mirror.
For complex chambers, 10 years is the minimum. After that, it also depends on the tools they have and their skills. The more competent they are, the more they'll be able to gain, perhaps in speed. In any case, in an exercise like this, time isn't the issue.
Yes, it is. The chronology given by the inscriptions suggests that these 7 chambers took about 28 years to complete. For Sudama, the most complex, it would have taken 12 years.
No. It's not possible. It's not possible. 12 years?
But these completion times have been calculated from the engraved inscriptions.
There's a gap between the inscriptions and the chambers. They weren't made at the same time, that's obvious. There's a discrepancy that gives me the impression that they were made much later. In any case, it's not the same period.
If you compare the cave and the inscriptions, there's a bit of a gap between the two. I mean, it's legible, but just not at the same level.
The engraving is done in a very basic way, which has nothing to do with the quality of the work. It's just punched. You could say that they needed to put a message on it. The person hadn't mastered engraving, and he just came to claim ownership.
Just because it's inscribed does not mean that it has to be from that era. The king may well have asked to put his name on something that already existed. The connection isn't necessarily obvious.
He's in power at this date, and then he gives the cave away 12 years later. But we don't say that he had the caves made or that he had them built. It's easy to imagine this famous king letting his hands on the caves and having them engraved with, "I offer them," that's all. But it's not necessarily him who had them made. There's no evidence that he had them made.
You wonder whether the people who had them engraved as rain shelters were really aware of the colossal amount of work that went into them, and of all the technical constraints that were completely unnecessary to the function of a simple shelter. Maybe by the time the chambers were gifted, the original purpose for them had long been forgotten.
Why these shapes? Why these perfect symmetries? Why go for mirror polish if it's just a shelter from the monsoon? All we need is a cave.
It's heartbreaking. It feels like the building has lost its sacred dimension. If it's dedicated and then given over to be used as a monsoon shelter, I find it hard to believe that that was its original vocation.
Obviously, when the king gives it away, it's because he no longer has any use for it, and that's why he's giving it away. So in fact, there's a risk that we're talking about things that happened before. How much earlier? After that, there are only archaeological digs nearby that would allow us to put some things in place. That's the problem with the written word. The written word is propaganda. So to make yourself look good, you're going to put text everywhere. Let's mention Ramses II, who put his name everywhere, even when he didn't do it.
When I see the work of these chambers, I'm stunned, amazed, in awe, speechless, bewildered. I'm at a loss. I say to myself, how could this have been done?
There's something fantastic about this chamber set alone. It's fantastic in terms of geometry, finish, and craftsmanship.
No matter how many times I think over it, it's disarming. This is the first time I've been so professionally confused.
Out of the fear of having our current version of history rewritten, some will argue that our ancestors were simply capable of specific skills that us modern people have lost. But if it was that simple, these chambers wouldn't be the only ones. For the construction sites that followed in ancient India, although grandiose and complex in their own way, have little in common with what we find here. The Ajanta site is a group of Buddhist caves carved into a long horseshoe-shaped basalt cliff. Construction began around the 2nd century BC, around a century after BARABAR. Abandoned and forgotten for centuries, rediscovered in 1819 by British soldiers, this UNESCO World Heritage Site is considered one of India's greatest architectural treasures. The term cave is rather reductive. These are actually temples and prayer halls, famous for their magnificent sculptures and murals, which reflect the teachings of Buddha. They required considerable resources. Some of these would have been used as shelters during the rainy season, perhaps inspiring the inscriptions on the Nagarjuna chambers. It's hard not to be impressed by the sheer amount of work that must have gone into building this site, spread over more than 6 centuries. What you see here was carved, not assembled. The whole thing was meticulously thought out and organised. Although this site is truly spectacular, the work does not compare with that of BARABAR and Nagarjuna. When the walls are not left rough, they are covered with sculpted bas reliefs and statues. The angles are ill-defined and the floors are not really flat. But perhaps even more spectacular than this site is the Ellora site. Also located in the district of Maharashtra, Ellora is a complex of 34 chambers carved out of the rock between the 6th and the 10th centuries, or 12th according to sources, over a total distance of almost 2 kilometers. Here again, the term cave is neither very representative nor very rewarding, as the chambers are sometimes immense on several levels. Twelve of them are Buddhist, 17 Hindu, and 5 Jain. As in Ajanta, each is an architectural masterpiece with multiple sculptures and bas-reliefs covering the walls. The most famous construction on this site is called Cave Number 16. Although it's a temple, it's not just any temple. The entire rock face has been sculpted to resemble Mount Kailash, the legendary home of Shiva. The temple features galleries, columns, shrines, and intricate carvings on several levels. Bear in mind that it was entirely carved from a single block. No statues or elements were added. Everything was thought out layer by layer, staircases, levels, columns, and statues. Considered the largest monolithic structure in the world, its size is estimated to be twice that of the Parthenon in Greece. But remarkable and gigantic as it is, the work accomplished only pleases the eye, as the companions say, as the precision does not go beyond what is visually sufficient. For when you take out a simple rangefinder, you quickly realise that no column foot is precisely aligned with its neighbour. But why should they? That's the question. With BARABAR and Nagarjuna, we're faced with two major questions. One, how were they achieved at this level of precision? And two, why did they need to be? There is a great dissonance between the stonemason's analysis of the work and what has been historically said about how these chambers were made. Notably, by Indologist Huntington, following his rigorous observation work in Lomas Rishi. The chamber is crucial to our understanding of the case, and we're going to look at it from the investigator's point of view. First of all, let's take a look at the historical opinions. For Cunningham and Fleet, the porch is a late addition, after the Maurya dynasty. An Ashoka inscription may have existed and been erased when the porch was built. According to Ferguson, the porch and chamber were built at the same time. According to Stern and Boyer, the porch is a late addition, around 200 years after the chambers were built. For Huntington, Lomas Rishi was BARABAR's last, after Sudama, Karan Chopra, and Visvazopri, and work was halted when Ashoka died for lack of funding. In his opinion, the porch and chamber were built at the same time. For Gupta, it would have nothing to do with Ashoka and Dasharatha because it has no inscriptions from them. Because being the only one of all the Mauryan chambers to have no original shape, because it's unfinished, and because its porch would be in Buddhist style, he believes it was carved long after BARABAR and Nagarjuna. And finally, Harry Falk agrees with Huntington and Ferguson. For him, the porch and the chamber were built at the same time, and the porch would not be Buddhist. In the face of differing opinions, we're confused. It's important to note, however, that it is from this chamber that the tools and methods for creating all other chambers were derived. Let's turn to the field. Lomas Rishi is the only one with a porch and curved outer frame. It's the only one without an original shape. Either it's the first of all and Sudama is a copy, or it's the other way around. The major difference between the two geometries being the position of the entrance passage. Its walls are surprisingly polished, while the rest of the building is still rough.
The state of progress in this cave is disconcerting.
Surprising.
All the rough work has to be done before polishing can begin. This polishing of the walls is an aberration.
Here, it's obvious the modus operandi is inconsistent. Starts everywhere and ends nowhere.
Same here, I find it hard to understand. It doesn't make it impossible, it just makes it more complicated.
We finish the whole shape and then polish it all in one go. There are key stages in the production chain. You can't finish one and then start another. No, everything has to be done at the same time.
It's just not logical. You can't do the finishing touches until you've mastered the rest.
You get the impression that they had to exploit a chamber that had been made and then not finished. But those who wanted to finish didn't understand, or I don't know. Honestly, I can't say why, but in any case, it's not the logic of the rest of the chambers.
Indian stonemasons traditionally start with the ceiling, but this time it's the other way round. In Sudama's dome, by playing with the light, we can observe the spectra of two circles, more clearly visible on the scans.
Here we see the first circle, then a second one inside, and when you look at the centers of each of these circles, they're all exactly aligned.
This suggests that the use of a mechanical device to carve out the dome, a technique that is nowhere to be seen in the Lomas Rishi dome. Pick blows are also too close to the final shape of the ceiling, and if too much digging is done, it can create holes, which can be seen on site. And finally, on the outer wall of this chamber, clues reinforce the idea of two periods of different size and technique, these grooves circled in red in this image. Well known to stonemasons, these grooves are the marks of sharpened chisel blades rubbed against granite. A few can be seen outside Sudama. Curiously, however, there are no such marks on the outer wall of Karanchopa or Visvasopri, nor on the outside of Gopika, Vadatika and Vapiyaka, showing that the stonecutters did not proceed in this way. So why the Sudama facade? Most probably because this niche, later added and unfinished.
The difficulty is the lack of archaeological documentation, because it's clear that there are gaps. The inscriptions, the entrance port. I have my doubts as to whether they were really contemporary with the excavation of the caves. As for the king's inscriptions, well, does it correspond to the same date as this? There's nothing to prove it. But sometimes, you just have to say you don't know.
To challenge these observations, we invited Eric Bernard to visit. Like geologist Eric Gontier before him, he first noticed the difference in workmanship between the porch and the interior of the finished chambers.
There's nothing upright. The shape was requested and the guy executed it in a hurry. The edges here, you also have a relatively well-adjusted curve, a kind of ogive, and you don't have any bottom edge cut correctly. It's out of question to imagine that the team that even started the work inside this one could have had anything to do with its execution. It's completely anachronistic. It's clear that the team had lost its geometry. In other words, it's been butchered everywhere. They were looking for reference points, and in the end it's been abandoned because the team couldn't complete the work that's been done elsewhere. It's obvious.
One detail we hadn't paid much attention to caught his eye. The small wall at the bottom is partially polished, while the upper part has not yet been dressed. This will generate what the cutters call a spectrum, i.e. an imprint that will show up in the light.
It's physical in the stone. You can feel it, because reworking the surface always leaves traces.
However, there are no such marks on the small walls of the other chambers, which means that they are not made in this way. The same applies to the unfinished floor, which would have required the entire bottom of the polished walls to be reworked. Let's recap. In this chamber, the cutting and polishing operations are carried out in an illogical sequence, and the tool strokes demonstrate a lack of method and rigour. The quality of the work on the porch is not the same as inside the chambers. There are no sharpening grooves on the chamber fronts, with the exception of the only chambers with unfinished elements, Sudama and Lomas Rishi. If Lomas Rishi is the first of the chambers, and if the porch was built at the same time as the interior, this should have been the blueprint for all of them. In that case, why don't Sudama and Karan Chopper next door and finished have porches? But if, as some Indologists believe, the porch was added later, then it should be visible to the eye. Turns out that it is.
It's very easy for any stonemason to put his hand here. You can see that the surface you have here is practically, to the touch, identical to the other chambers, i.e. with precision. And when you slide over a ridge that's over here, the stonemason who took over this surface and executed the porch found himself carving really awkwardly. It's clear that there's an inconsistency of control, and so we find it here. All this part here is recessed or badly polished or badly cut. And then back to the porch here again, there are huge cavities. On a surface of 40 centimeters, there's a depression of almost a centimeter. Any stonemason who comes here to look at the surface will tell you that there's a problem. And a problem with the workmanship. And a problem with the workmanship between this part and the rest is really obvious.
Whoever carved this porch obviously had the intention to complete the interior. The tool marks we see inside clearly come from the porch builders, and therefore can't shed any light on how the other chambers were built. Either this porch dates back to the Ashoka period, or it was added much later. But if it dates from the Ashoka period, then the other chambers are much older and had long since been completed by the time they were gifted to the Ajivika people. That would explain why their true function had already been forgotten.
I agree with you that the original idea has disappeared.
Given the complexity of the work presented by these chambers, it's difficult to believe that their original purpose was simply for shelter, unless of course you've inherited them and are unaware of the complex work they entail. A month after our visit to BARABAR, we went back to see Eric Bernard.
The biggest problem in this case is the one who imagined the shape and said, well, I demand that, and I'm going to find a team who's going to produce it for me. Even now in research labs and production labs, it's a colossal task to bring these two worlds together. It's been done here without any precedent. The requirement for geometry has a reason. We have no references in the West of an example like this type. Monolithic and cut like this in one go, and moreover in a cavity.
What was the state of play in terms of the tools and methods?
Rough work can be done very quickly. I mean, if you're vigorous and fit and have the right technique, you can do a great job. Afterwards, it's this finishing approach. Because on top of that, you're in the dark with candles and lighting systems that are completely... So afterwards, there's a timing that you can't control at all. So I looked around looking for mistakes, of course. On site, I saw flashes, I saw the size spectra that come out. So that reassured me a little, in a way, to say to myself, yeah, these are colleagues of mine who have done this, but all the same.
What can we compare the work in the chambers to?
The only reference in the archive is this pedestal that was cut to house the Luxor obelisk at Concorde. And this artifact is the only reference we have in terms of volume of shape, i.e. 16 cubic meters, i.e. 40 tons of granitic rock, quite similar to BARABARs, but obviously quarry cut, i.e. taken from quarries, etc. The obelisk was made of granite. We know very well that at the time in 1836 that they were still using tools and techniques from the dawn of time.
Since we were on site, we decided to use the roughness tester on this perfectly documented base. The first RZ of 60 microns, the second of 47, and third 25. A far cry from the measurements recorded at BARABAR, bearing in mind that this object was not polished vertically, but horizontally, in the direction of gravity, which is absolutely uncomparable. A detail that will probably speak to engineers here is the difference in the angle of inclination between the large and small walls. Why this change in angle? And why 88.5 degrees? 1.5 degrees from vertical, which is hardly visible to the naked eye.
It's 10 times more difficult to keep to that angle than on a well-controlled vertical wall.
A seemingly insignificant detail, but one that must have been important, since it's a feature repeated from one chamber to the next and in symmetry. It looks like a process of experimentation to improve shapes, different angles for a specific purpose. But what? Speaking of the polish, there are a few chips in the polish of the finished chambers. As here at the bottom of the current chopper wall, we thought these were later markings, but Eric thinks they were weaknesses in the granite at the time of cutting.
The final polishing phase has been made without trying to fix or hide the natural flaws in the stone. You can see that the polish was added to an extremely rigorous and defined shape in terms of dimensions. And afterwards, you can see that this polish finish is not at all designed to be aesthetic, not at all related to the need to be visually pleasing or anything else like that. It's completely, in my opinion, to be forgotten.
A polish more technical than aesthetic. Another stonemason confided to us that if these chambers had been created with such precision and minimalism, and were devoid of religious imagery or motifs of any kind, it was a sign that the objects had a precise function. The scans revealed another curiosity, discovered by researcher Quentin Leplat. As all the entrance passages are at 90 degrees,
Vadatika's chamber has a corridor that's slightly off-center, i.e. not on the same axis as the chamber.
This is the entrance corridor here, or there, which, when extended, comes to tap Vapiaco at 90 degrees.
And on top of that, the axis of these two corridors indicates the north-south and east-west axes. For me, these two caves were conceived as a whole, and not as two independent things. This means that they have tracing methods for transferring interior tracings to the outside, which allow them, with surveying systems that I'm not familiar with, to transfer what's inside perfectly to the outside, without any loss of geometry.
Geometry is such a constraint, you can't just leave it to chance. This is extremely important, because when you're faced with a geometric volume that's extremely well mastered, it's because there's an extremely complex or well mastered thought process. It's not just a matter of guesswork. It's also quite amazing that they've made a link between the two caves in these huge rocks. We're small, I mean, humanly speaking, we're dealing with a major geological element here.
what's the point of this feature, which can only be discovered with a 3D scan? Why position the corridor perpendicular to the long side of the other chamber? Why add this constraint? Let's take a look at the geometry of the chambers. Through on-site measurements, Harry Falk determined the value of the measurement standard used, which he called Morian yard or BARABAR yard to be around 85.5 centimetres. Thanks to the scans, Quentin Leplat did the same work on his side and was able to refine this value.
We can see that there's a particular geometry that emerges. Proportions, for example. So if I have proportions of 2 units on the width and 3 on the length, I can quite easily find a common denominator. And it just so happens that this common denominator recurs on all 5 scans I've studied.
For some unknown reason, this standard varies very precisely from chamber to chamber.
Give or take a few millimeters, on average what I find is 85.4, the average value of a theoretical BARABAR yard, which was used to size these chambers, because obviously we used a unit of measurement. We saw how we positioned the corridor entrances, we saw the modular aspect, so there's obviously a unit of measurement.
This standard made it possible to understand the floor geometry of the chambers.
Proportions here are very simple, 2/3. 2 for width, 3 for length, and we have the proportions of the chambers. And those next door, well, it's exactly the same. They're 2x3 proportions. The resulting measurement is the same. We're dealing with something that's clearly calibrated according to geometric and metrological criteria. It's not something designed, obviously, for storing flour or sheltering from the rain, but something much more carefully thought out.
We have a ratio of 5x12 with Karan chopper and 3x7 with Kopika. But let's move on to the volume of space in the chambers, as the scans show them precisely, allowing Quentin Leplat to notice an extraordinary feature.
They have volumes of space that have ratios in whole numbers, 7x8, with a precision that is truly remarkable.
Remember your maths class from school? If the volume of Vadatika is 7, then the volume of Vapiyaka is 8. Same thing with Sudama. If the volume of the Great Hall is 12, then the volume of the dome is 5. A ratio of 12 to 5 already present in Karan Chopper's floor geometry, whose volume is linked to that of Kopika.
Well, here we have an even simpler 2/3 ratio.
If Karan Chopper's volume is 2, then Kopika's is 3.
And on top of that, if I convert them, these 2 caves, into Marian yards or BARABAR yards, as you like, the unit of measurement I deduced before, well, I end up with 200 and 300 cubic yards of BARABAR.
200 cubic yards and 300 cubic yards, 200 and 300 precisely, for volumes in a ratio of 2x3, which also makes it possible to deduce the value of the BARABAR yard from the volumes. Skeptics may argue that these are just 2 of the 5 chambers, but the volume ratios of 7/8 between Vadatika and Vapiyaka and 5/12 between Sodoma's dome and its Great Hall show that the designers knew how to calculate the dimensions of all the chambers so that their volumes were related.
This is certainly not by chance. This is impossible. But if someone is capable of planning something, and you cannot achieve 200 or 300 while you are cutting out a cave, you have to plan it beforehand. That means you can plan and think in cubical whole numbers. And this is something unthought of. Nobody ever thought of something that you could prove, and everybody could go there nowadays with our modern machines and have the machine find out the cubical content of Kopika, and then it comes out it's 300 times a cube of Morian yards.
Remember how complex chamber shapes can be? To find out the volumes without going through the scans, you need to break each one down into sections of simple volumes, calculate each portion of volume, and then add them together. But the problem facing BARABAR's designers is the opposite and far more complex. It involves determining each of the dimensions of the chambers, length, width, height, radius of curves, etc., so that the finished volumes add up to the expected numbers. Given the complexity of each chamber's geometry, this goes far beyond the Pythagorean triangle.
Not only does this confirm the use of the BARABAR yard, it also confirms the fact that we sized these two chambers with integer volume ratios, and the precision, according to the data we have, is 1 to 1500. So it's ultra precise. I don't see how we could do any better. And of course, you have to master the number pi with many decimals. Because if you want to make calculations with all the cones, cylinders, and spheres there are, you just can't play with the approximate fractions of the number pi. You have to know it very, very well.
The design and dimensioning of these geometries involve complex equations, demonstrating a mathematical level that was totally beyond the supposed capabilities of the time.
So I think what you have found out here is breathtaking, and it's unique, unbelievable. It shows that the geometrists working maybe hand in glove with the Iranian stonecutters, that they could introduce their knowledge, and they did so. And at the same time, they knew that nobody entering these caves will see these whole numbers. They are inside a construction produced from whole numbers, but you don't see that you're inside of it.
These chambers were then made without any possible latitude, anticipating what each cutting step would remove until the final polish was achieved. As the stonemasons told us loud and clear, we need to add to this high level of mathematics an exceptional mastery of execution, which can only be acquired following a long period of apprenticeship. The problem is, it's nowhere to be seen. That's why the scans change everything, and why we need to get away from the preconceptions of history to understand these chambers. The shape of the chamber entrances also raise questions. In Ajanta and Ellora, we didn't see any trapezoidal doors, as this is not a typical Indian shape. In his book dedicated to BARABAR, Echoing Huntington, Indologist Gupta evokes a similarity with Egyptian door frames, also trapezoidal, which he immediately dismisses on the grounds that the dating would not match. But the dating of the chambers is by no means certain. During the shoot of our previous film, we also saw this type of trapezoidal entrance in Peru, on very precisely executed constructions, as here at Coricancha in Cuzco. Ironically, polished granite surfaces can be found in Egypt almost as precisely as in BARABAR, in the mysterious vats of the Saqqara Serapeum. They too have been dated on the basis of questionable inscriptions. What if we were to find ourselves in the footsteps of the same builders? Because we noticed something else, this time on the Sudama chamber, the most complex of all.
A surveyor takes measurements as objectively as possible, using equipment whose technical characteristics he knows, including those famous uncertainties. And then, at the end of the day, we come and see what we've measured. And what do we find when we measure the object as we've assembled it? It's actually 11 meters long for the chamber. After that, it's 11.008 meters, but you can go down to 11.004 meters or 11.011 meters. For me, it's all the same. 5.96 meters for the width. We have a sphere here, with a radius of 3 meters, a center, 1 meter above the ground. We've got a cone here, a cone here, and then the vault walls here, which are exactly 2 meters. The vaulted ceiling here also has a radius of 3.03 meters and is the center of the main cylinder, 1.02 meters above the ground. That's it. So 11 meters, 6 to 1 meter. We're just stating the facts as factually as possible. I take 1 point, I take several of these points, and that's what we get. So the observation is that here we find metric values once or twice, or 3 or 4 times, but on 3D volumes, on a regularity, on a total length, on a punctual point. It's quite a remarkable thing, quite interesting to note.
A simple observation, but a confusing one. Since the meter was established in France in 1795, it seems impossible that these dimensions could have been thought of and measured in meters. And yet with Sudama, we find whole measurements only in meters. We don't find this when measuring in the BARABAR yard.
It's true that we often come across the meter when we're measuring. It's highly likely that the designer thought things through with the meter and the BARABAR yard.
In the previous film, we observed the meter at various major ancient sites around the world, in Bolivia, in Egypt, in France, and now in BARABAR. This poses an obvious historical problem, since calculating the meter implies you've been able to accurately measure the Earth's circumference and having it divided into 40 million. But perhaps we've just rediscovered what they've already calculated. The royal cubit used in the Great Pyramid is linked to the meter by a circle 1 meter in diameter, the circumference of which is equal to 6 times the cubit, which is considered a coincidence when choosing the meter in 1795. But in BARABAR, there also seems to be a geometric link between the meter and the yard.
If I say that the BARABAR yard is a circle of 1 yard in diameter, the perimeter, if I divide it into 6, as I did for the royal cubit, what emerges is a cubit of 44.72 centimeters. And this cubit of 44.72, if I make it into a double square, the diagonal, it's a meter. The design of the BARABAR chambers is all about circles and right angles, and square figures. Generally speaking, when we design things, we use compasses and squares. Their work uses this kind of geometry, so it's possible that we've deployed both measurements in a single piece.
Not only did the skills come from somewhere, but it feels like the specification of the chambers, which hold up to modern industrial standards, have an objective reason and a specific purpose. But which one? It all depends on how we look at them. If they had been made by engineers from the future, we'd think there must be something important to discover in their operation, something we don't know yet, information encoded, because the future equals progress. But they come from the past, with history telling us that our ancestors were drastically less technologically advanced. So how else could they be anything other than curious-looking shelters from the rain, as we are certain ancient civilizations were always less technologically advanced? According to our current knowledge, human beings like you and me have existed for at least 230,000 years. 230,000 years is an incredibly long time. We would have remained hunter-gatherers for around 220,000 years, during which time we would have roamed the planet on foot to establish ourselves almost everywhere, and human civilization would have taken off only a few thousand years ago. For a long time, we thought it was Sumer, around 6,000 years ago. Then we discovered Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which puts the date back at least 7,000 years. But there are still many mysteries to our past. As in Egypt, where history no longer even remembers how the pyramids of Giza were built, at least a few millennia ago. No big deal compared to the 230,000-year history of our humanity. The Egyptians have written extensively on all sorts of subjects, but apparently nothing on the construction of the pyramids, nor the function of them, which today are only considered as funerary tombs. Either nothing was ever written, or it was erased by their successors. History has always been written by the winners, the kings, emperors, and dictators who over the centuries have dismissed their predecessors, each time rewriting the past to put themselves in the best light. There are numerous examples. The Neanderthal man, a prehistoric ape man rehabilitated by recent discoveries, the Gauls, a coarse and barbaric people according to the Roman propaganda until recently, and finally the Greeks and their surprising skills, which enabled them to create the Antikythera mechanism. So history isn't false, but just partial, and relying on it blindly, dangerous. As far as BARABAR and Nagarjuna are concerned, history doesn't tell us anything. Either no one has been bothered to record how the chambers were made and what they were really used for, or it's been lost or destroyed. The name Ajivika was scratched out on the inscriptions, but fortunately not completely. Why scratch out these inscriptions, if not to try and make this mention disappear? History also failed to remember Ashoka, nicknamed Ashoka the Great. He was an important king and founder of Indian history, without whom Buddhism probably would have disappeared. But he was forgotten for almost 2,000 years, before being rediscovered just 2 centuries ago thanks to his pillars. Anything that isn't based on proof, i.e., an indisputable fact, is just another belief. Continuing this thought, anything that isn't or hasn't been proven is therefore always open to question, and could potentially be called into question.
We have to consider everything, because we don't know. The question is, will we ever come to a conclusion that holds water?
Practicing Descartes' art of the clean slate means not rejecting a hypothesis that you believe to be impossible. Difficult in reality because we are all, absolutely all, influenced by our beliefs. And not just in the religious world. The belief, for example, that although our human history may contain a few gaps or grey areas, nothing could fundamentally call into question the linear narrative of the historical timeline. The belief that the direction of progress is linear from the wheel to smartphones, and that it couldn't be any other way. The belief that the chambers at BARABAR and Nagasjuni have nothing useful to teach us, the modern inventors of satellites and artificial intelligence. Yet these chambers appear totally out of place and seem to have a more technical purpose than an artistic or religious one. Wiping the slate clean means accepting that our history may indeed have forgotten part of our past, and being open to considering this. Today, as in the past, no one is going to go to such great, colossal lengths to achieve such precise results if you don't need to.
When you really get down to the nitty-gritty of the analysis, something else emerges. Another philosophy, another will.
For me, it's obvious. It's obviously a scientific object. Such an exceptional object of measurement that the reason for these objects must have a scientific use. It can only be that.
Well, it has been observed by several scholars that the sound inside such a cave is increasing. If you say something, the sound accelerates, and it would be impossible, I think, that people meet inside these caves and talk to each other.
So, if on top of that there's another feature, which is sound, which maybe is after all what they were looking for, it may explain the sloping walls, it may explain the vaulted ceilings, made with 3 different radiuses. The mirror-like polish, in fact, favors propagation and reverberation, so it would justify the shape and why we went for a mirror polish in these caves. We could have stopped at the previous stage since we'd already mastered the geometry.
Since the chambers are carved out of the mass, the vaulted ceilings have no structural purpose and could have had any shape. When you enter these dark chambers, the interaction of sound with their geometry is immediately apparent, producing impressive effects that are difficult to reproduce with microphones. The most remarkable thing about these chambers is the combination of resonance and reverberation, as we've just heard with the voice of Tritasina. Reverberation time is the time it takes for the sound to decay after the source has been switched off. Acoustic resonances, on the other hand, correspond to the specific frequencies at which sound is amplified. The low absorption rate of granite and the geometry of the walls produce different effects between low and high frequencies. But are these effects in the chambers unintended consequences due to their geometries, or are they intentionally designed? Since we discovered them, we've been experimenting and recording. In May 2017, at the same time as the scans, we recorded calibrated balloon explosions and frequency variations across the entire spectrum audible to humans, to understand their acoustics. We then had the data analysed, but the instruments were not precise enough. So we returned to the site in March 2020 with very precise measurement protocol, 2 sound level meters, a recorder, and balloons. We recorded around 100 explosions in the chambers with our sound level meters. We then had all the new data analysed by several acousticians. For the record, through a numerical calculation, one of the reports concludes that a 74.9 Hz emission source placed on the ground in the middle of the Sudama Dome would produce a sound that would be highly amplified around it. This is what we had accidentally experimented with in 2020 by broadcasting a frequency of 75 Hz with our small speaker placed on the floor in the centre of the dome.
Là, il n'y est plus, là. Je pense que j'ai tué l'ancien. Ah bon?
In practical terms, our speaker blew. This happened again when we returned in March 2023 to check some data and make new recordings. And here's what we found. These chambers are a very special case, as they combine a number of features not currently looked for by modern acousticians. First and foremost, they make speech unintelligible. It becomes inaudible when you're more than 50 centimeters from the source. In other words, they're not made for listening to preaching or speaking.
Le milieu est là-bas. Et en même temps qu'elle est très légèrement incurvée, elle est aussi très légèrement inclinée. Si tu arrives à ça.
They combine both reverberation and resonance. Low-frequency reverberation times are very high. By way of comparison, in Notre Dame, low-frequency reverberation lasts between 10 and 12 seconds, while in the Sudama Dome it reaches 62 seconds, and in Valatika, 70 seconds. For around 100 years, acousticians have been building reverberation chambers to measure an object's absorption, i.e. the acoustic energy it will retain. If the reverberation lasts up to 15 seconds, they generally neutralize the resonance effect. But in BARABAR and Nagarjuna, resonances are also very pronounced, meaning that certain frequencies are amplified and heard much louder. These exceptional reverberation measurements verify the specific shape of these chambers do produce a function. According to the acousticians, who confirmed our suspicion, they are due to the granite's low absorption rate, but also to the polish, the inclination of the walls, and the symmetries of the chamber's shape. Because polished surfaces increase the reverberation of very high frequencies. Symmetries enhance low frequencies through the presence of strong resonances. The inclination of the walls neutralizes the floating echo effect and seems to play with focusing, i.e. the concentration of sound in particular places. This is also the case with the vaulted ceilings. Some experiments show an extremely interesting focal return between 70 and 80 centimeters in height at Gopika, where sensory perceptions could be maximized in a seated position, but our research is still ongoing. Although we can clearly see that they intentionally design the geometry of the chambers to get specific volumes of the space, we have not yet been able to confirm any acoustic intentionality in the designs of the chambers. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any, because acousticians were struck by a detail. Vapiyaka, Gopika, and Karanchopa each resonate at a natural frequency of 34.4 Hz, precisely measured from the balloon burst of 2020. In Sudama, we find 34.5 Hz, just 0.1 Hz apart. Temperature influences the measurements, and as we're not sure of Sudama's temperature at the time of our recordings, we're only going to include the first three, Vapiyaka, Gopika, and Karanchopa. Given the scarcity of resonance frequencies below 50 Hz for each of the chambers, and their vast differences in size and shape, it's remarkable to find 3 of them share the same natural frequency. This strongly suggests the builders did this intentionally. If this is the case, it adds yet another level of complexity to their ability to calculate volumes of space, as it would mean that they would have been able to anticipate the frequencies produced by the geometries. Sound has always played a central role in the founding myths and sacred narratives of the world's many spiritual traditions. One of the acousticians pointed out that the effect of using reverberant chambers on meditation and spiritual chanting is well known. But if the effect is known, the chambers of BARABAR and Nagarjuna seem quite lonely. These phenomenal pieces of architecture were totally misunderstood by following generations, who relegated them as simple shelters from the rain. Yet everything about them testifies to a long process of technical ability. Unless you believe in miracles, these chambers can't spring from nowhere and be unique in the world. There must be others elsewhere. If frequencies do play a role in these chambers, would it be more felt than heard? Could it be used to interact with the human body through a combination of geometries and frequencies in relation to the person and perhaps their consciousness? Music can be relaxing, uplifting, emotionally arousing, or down to earth. But sound waves can also heal, as modern medical research explores through the destruction of tumours by impacting precise areas. Songs can also induce altered states of consciousness, i.e., a different perception of reality, which our elders all over the planet seem to know so well. If it's possible to induce altered states of consciousness to the sound of a drum in a forest, what impact could these complex geometries might have on this phenomenon? Why did our distant ancestors one day build these unrivaled masterpieces? Why such complex symmetrical geometric shapes? Why these specifications that hold up to actual industry standards? Why such precision visible only when scanned with modern technology? How did they manage to create these chambers with such exceptional mastery? Where did they come from? What were they used for? What was their science? After years of exploration and reflection, it's clear to us that this colossal undertaking had a precise, important purpose. So important that its builders had accomplished the impossible, to create these chambers so strange in their design and yet looking so futuristic. Too simple in appearance, too complex in reality, we believe they embody the expression of a thought and science different from our own, through the apparent simplicity of its genius. A thought that could be from tomorrow's humanity. An entire universe could open up to exploration, maybe the very one the builders of BARABAR were tapping into. Perhaps in these troubled times, this is what this place is trying to tell us. not only who we were, but also who we can be. Extraordinary builders, capable of the worst as well as the best.
Woof.